It is no secret that backlight is one of my favorite natural lighting techniques to use when I'm taking photos outdoors and sometimes even when I'm indoors. I love how versatile backlight is. You can capture bright and airy portraits, photos with lots of lens flares, you can capture photos with very subtle backlight that makes your subject pop in the frame, or photos where the backlight is super obvious and streaming in through your image. So in today's video, I want to share 5 easy tips that you can use at your next photo shoot to improve your backlight techniques and capture beautiful photos. And I also want to say thank you to Canva for sponsoring this video. Backlight is when your light source, which in our case is the sun, is positioned behind your subject. You can see in all these example photos here that the sun is behind my subject to be able to capture this style of photography. And I have a little diagram here that I made with Canva that I'm going to be using to share my first tip, which is to position yourself at different angles from the sun when taking photos. In our first diagram, where the sun, the subject, and the camera are all in a line, I actually don't shoot backlit photos like this very often. The reason for this is that the sun will end up being too bright if you keep it in the frame. In these photos here, the sun wasn't quite at golden hour position yet, so having the sun directly behind the subject like this will cause a complete whiteout, which isn't great as you can't even see our subject. Or it ends up competing for too much attention in the frame if it's directly behind or very close to your subject's face. Instead, to be able to integrate the backlight into our photos and have the light look more blended and natural, I like to shoot at an angle from the sun. So I will be taking portraits within these positions instead. When we go back to look at the first few backlight examples from today's video, you can see that all of these have the sun to the left or the right of the subject to have that beautiful backlit look rather than directly behind the subject. The last thing to keep in mind while changing your angles to the sun is to not angle yourself too far. It is possible to accidentally move too much to the left or right of your subject where your portrait is no longer backlit and you have more prominent side light instead. In this shot here, we have side light, which works really nicely in this photo as the sun was very close to the horizon, so it makes the water nice and vibrant. But on the other hand, when I angled myself back to the left-hand side, I was able to bring back that backlight. You can see the sun hitting both sides of Hailey's hair. There is a bit of haze from the backlight adding to the softness of the image, and the colors are muted. Here's another example. In this photo, Charlotte is in the shade and the background is lit from the side because I am in this position from the sun. So she doesn't really stand out in the photo. Compared to this image where I am at the correct angle from the sun, we have that soft glow to the photo and she is framed nicely with the backlight to help her pop in the frame. My second tip is to find parts of your location that you can use to diffuse the backlight, and there are 2 ways that you can do this. The first way is to keep an eye out in your location for trees, buildings, or any objects that will partially block out the sun. One of the most common ways that I like to diffuse backlight is by using trees because you can capture really beautiful and interesting results. Diffusing your backlight also means you can include more of the sun in your frame as well, which can lead to dreamier looking photos with lens flares and lens haze without it overpowering your shot. The second way to diffuse your backlight is to change your composition. One technique that I don't use that often but can work really well is if you block out the sun with your subject. You can see in this photo the sun is directly behind Lily, which is causing a cool halo effect around her, bringing your eye directly to the subject in the frame. Another way you can do this is by cropping the sun out of your photos completely. Here's an example of the sun in the frame. We have a beautiful outline of light around Lily, but since the sun is in the frame, it's very bright and causing a bit of lens flare, so it can look a bit distracting. I instead moved to the side and cropped the sun out, which resulted in this photo. We still have a beautiful outline around Lily, but the background is even now and she stands out in the photo. Before we move on to our next tip, I want to let you know more about the sponsor of today's video, Canva. If you're a photographer, run a business, or do anything online, then Canva is a must-have tool as part of your workflow. Canva is an online design and publishing tool with a huge library of templates to choose from where you can create designs from social media posts, videos, newsletters, and so much more. With Canva Pro, you can access a content library of over 100 million stock photos, videos, and audio to use with your designs. One of my favorite tools in Canva Pro is Magic Resize, so you can easily reuse one design across different platforms. So if you want to check out all these tools for your own business, you can try Canva Pro free for 45 days by using the link in my description. Something that's really important to look for when shooting with backlight is that you want the light to be as even as possible. So as you can see in this frame, we've got a really nice kind of halo of light around her hair, which looks really good. If we kind of turn a little bit this way, if you wanted to face towards me. So that's kind of backlit. We have the sun is a little bit more to the side and it's very strong on the left side of the frame and the left side of the portrait, and then the right hand side of the frame is quite dark and shadowy. So something that I find really useful is that if you're shooting on mirrorless, you won't have this issue, but if you're shooting on a DSLR, I do like to turn my LCD screen on just like this and just walk around your subject a little bit until you find that really nice even lighting. Something you want to look out for when using backlight is to avoid any super bright spots or very dark areas in your background, as this can make your image look unbalanced. This happens the most when you're shooting outside of ideal lighting, so for example, a few hours before sunset when the sun is brighter and harsher. I think this is so important to keep an eye out for in your photos, as we don't always get the chance to shoot during golden hour. During this photo shoot, we were working with harsh light. I decided to diffuse the backlight with trees to make it as soft as possible, but we do have the ground in the shot, which is borderline overexposed. Because that patch on the floor is so bright, it does make it a little distracting in the overall photo. One of the ways that you can work around that are to getting closer to your subject so you can crop out the overexposed part of the image and keep the lighting even. Instead of shooting in portrait orientation, you can also change to landscape orientation to again crop out any bright or dark areas in your location and have more of those midtones filling the frame instead. The last thing you can try is changing your focal length. These photos here were taken on a 35mm prime lens, which, as you might know, is my favorite focal length, but since it's so wide, you can see a lot of the location and thus a lot of that uneven lighting on the floor and in the trees. I instead changed my lens over to an 85mm prime, which is more compressed, so you can't see as much of the location in the shot and the lighting looks a lot more even. My second last tip is to decide whether you want to use a lens hood or not. So I've shown you a lot of backlit example images that I've taken throughout this video, and you might notice there are two different kinds of backlit shots that I like to capture. Sometimes I love capturing images with lots of lens flares and lens haze in the shot. I think it looks so dreamy and it can add a lot of magic to a photo depending on the look that you're after. So if you love these kinds of images, then I would suggest to take off your lens hood to make it easier to capture lens flares. On the other hand, I also have cleaner looking backlit photos with more contrast and pop. In these photos, I am using a lens hood to help shield the lens from the sun and avoid any lens flares in my photos. Something I like to do when I'm shooting backlit portraits is to very slightly underexpose my overall frame just to save as much detail as possible in the highlights of the photo, because the background will be quite bright because of the sun and then your subject will be more in the shadows because it's backlit. So I want to show you guys just a side-by-side comparison of what it looks like when I expose for my subject, and then I'll take another shot where I just slightly underexpose it a little bit. If we take a look at our histogram over here and I bring up the overlay, you can see the overexposed photo has a lot of whites clipping in the shot compared to the underexposed image that has a little less, especially if you keep an eye on the background here. If we bring down our highlights here in Lightroom, you are able to save some of the detail in the background of the brighter photo, but in the darker photo, we can save a lot more to have an even looking background with a lot of color and detail. Then, to bring our subject back in the frame, I will increase the exposure and shadows and bring down the blacks to add contrast back into the photo. I personally like making sure I'm clipping as little whites as possible when taking my photos, so I can have extra wiggle room when it comes to editing and creating a balanced looking photo. I took these images on the Sony a7 III, so with the dynamic range from that camera, it's pretty easy to edit both shots to get them to look very similar. But on other cameras, maybe if you don't have as much information or dynamic range in your files to work with, it's really important to decide while you're taking the photo what kind of exposure you want. Typically with digital cameras, it's a lot easier to recover the shadows than it is to recover the highlights, which is why I choose to keep my exposure on the darker side. But that is all I have for today's video. I really hope this helped you out, and if you have any questions, let me know down in the comments, and let me know if you'd like to see more videos like this about working with natural light. But as always, thank you so much for watching. I make new videos every single week, so I will see you all next time. Bye!